This is Yvette Carnell from BreakingBrown.com, YourBlackWorld.net. I'm joined today by Pascal Robert from Black Agenda Report. And the reason that we're going to have a conversation today is because you all had to. There's no way you missed the Ebony cover with the Cosbys on the cover with shattered glass across the face with the pinnacle of it with all the striations coming towards Bill Cosby's face. And this is very interesting, coming from Ebony, which is the sort of the bastion of the aspirational black middle class. So Pascal put something. He wrote something earlier on his Facebook page. If you don't follow Pascal on Facebook, you probably should. But he put something on his Facebook page that really brought home like how important this Ebony cover was. And because of that, I'm going to frame this conversation by letting you know up front exactly and reading you his quote and then letting him expound on that and let us talk about the importance of this Ebony covenant. Let me just read you what he wrote. He says, "This is the November cover of Ebony magazine's family issue. It's an obvious, intentionally provocative challenge to the sacred status of the Cosby Show in the light of Bill Cosby's allegations. I've made it pretty clear that I found the show problematic for a variety of reasons having nothing to do with Cosby's allegations. I'm very ambivalent about this cover because my position on popular culture and its use of the black image is one of profound distrust and disdain for the whole enterprise. Popular culture is not designed to edify you. It's designed to commodify and exploit you. Popular culture is one of the most effective tools of the power elite in maintaining social control. Considering any of its products sacred is a bigger problem than this magazine cover, in my opinion." Now that would have been even more powerful if Pascal hadn't interrupted me with his cough. But but Pascal, listen, I don't think you understand, or maybe you do, but in that one passage, you basically went at the Cosby legacy in terms of, like, a lot of people have made the argument, right, that and I've made this argument too, like, well, let's separate Cosby, right, from let's separate Bill Cosby from the Cosby Show. But what you're saying is that we were too caught up in the Cosby Show to begin with. Like, what is that what you're saying? Am I mischaracterizing you?
No, I think you got it absolutely correct. Thanks again for having me on, Yvette. Is that my larger problem is the concept in which people, particularly people of color, African American people, view themselves through popular culture as if this is actually a reflection of our own creation. And part of the problem of that reality is that we have to understand that there is a history in which African Americans have been treated in American popular culture. And that history is not about edifying the black image or black people. It's about using and manipulating the way in which black people are viewed in a way to further, capitalism, racism, white supremacy, and the economic order. And the larger point I was trying to say is that, before we get into the politics of what Bill Cosby did or was accused of, that the whole notion of us needing a Cosby Show to validate us to American society is problematic, and it's become increasingly endemic in the post-civil rights era, where we see this hyper-capitalization of the black popular cultural image. And this is something, you and I are close enough in age to have witnessed this really starting in the 70s and the 80s with the rise of blaxploitation films, the hyper infusion of capital into black music, hi-fi quality black soul and whatnot. And one thing we have to realize is these things do not happen absent of political context. If you read things like, the Kerner Commission reports and many of the reports that were issued after the investigations of the 60s and the Black Power era, one thing that was effectively stated by the power elite, government and the industrial, mechanisms that govern our society is that it was a threat to America to have young black people politicized in a way that was too radical, that challenged the status quo. Noam Chomsky talks about this extensively in a video. As a matter of fact, you can find it on YouTube where he's talking with Kathleen Cleaver of the Black Panther Power. That, listen, one of the main things that was crucial to American ruling elite, to the American ruling elite after particularly the Black Power era, is that we had to neutralize any kind of sense of political radicalism amongst black youth, particularly black youth, so that we do not have them challenging the order. And one of the means and ways in which that was done effectively was through infusing, popular culture, particularly dance music from disco to hi-fi soul, and these types of forms of art. And my goal here is not to say like, oh, music is evil, TV is evil, we shouldn't watch TV. No, that's not my point here, and that would be ridiculous to think that we can all live in some kind of Spartan vacuum but we don't consume pop culture. Listen, I grew up in New York listening to R&B, soul, hip hop, black movies and all that. I understand that, but my larger point is that it is very rare that we take a very critical look at how exactly the image of black people are being manipulated in these spaces, but we truly do not control, and we are not creating and controlling the depiction of that image. How this relates to Cosby, and why many people might find it strange that I had a problem with Cosby, is that I grew up in the 80s watching Cosby. I'm not saying that the show is not entertaining, and I'm not saying that the show did not have some value. Yes, were there people who might have been inspired to go to college to see a positive family? I mean, I don't deny that. But the larger point that my problem with Cosby is that in the political space of the 1980s, during the Reagan years and the Reagan administration, when you had, the rise of the crack epidemic, massive cutting down of government programs, the most popular image of black people on television is, a upper middle class black family living in Shangri-La in New York City, which I grew up in at that time, which was a very racialized environment with no sense of racial angst or anger or animus. Basically, like, let the good times roll. Everything is okay. And what my basic point is that it is not an accident in the context of how the black image has been used throughout popular culture to see that during a regime that many African Americans felt was profoundly hostile to their goals and opinions and thought, that the image of black people on television is one of joy and almost kind of political acquiescence to the status quo, as opposed to challenging it in question. For example, even though Norman Lear produced Good Times, which was a white-produced show, we understand that. However, the one thing that you notice in black television and black popular culture in the 70s, and I'm not trying to make an evaluation as one better than the other, but these are certain facts, is that there was a certain kind of politicism in the discourse of black TV, even black comedy, going back to Flip Wilson, about what was the condition of black people in America in the late 70s, even in the Jimmy Carter era, even from the Jeffersons and on. You could not divorce the presence of the black family in television and popular culture in the 70s from some kind of racial or political commentary about what was going on. George Jefferson, whether you like the character or not, clearly had a racial animus when dealing with, the other characters. If you want to get in, I don't want to dominate the conversation. Please, you sound like you have a point.
Here's a question. Here's a question I want to ask. Some people would say, I think when I listen to what you're saying, the key question here is whether or not this is a product, or whether Cosby is a result of, or a manifestation of this sort of denialism that is being used as a tool by the powers that be to kind of keep us distracted away from exactly what is, as opposed to where we want to be, or if this is an aspect of aspirationalism. This is what we want to be as black people, and black people watch it and they go to school because they want to reach for that. So I guess if I play devil's advocate, like I know some people will say, like you just said, well, Cosby made me want to have that family, and Cosby made me want to go to school and do the right thing. Does that in any way offset, what may have been detrimental in terms of turning a blind eye to everything else that was going on in the black community?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think it's a fair question, and I think that the reason why it's even a better question is that it leads me to an answer that shows that the black community is and always have been politically diverse and complex. The answer to that question depends on what your politics are as a black person. Mm-hmm. If you are a black person whose only aspiration is to be middle class, have a nice family, get a nice job, and I'm not saying that makes you innately evil or a sellout or duplicitous at all, but what I'm saying is that is the goal of a large number of the black community. But if you are an African American who has a certain political worldview that sees the working of American capitalism and racism as a function of a mechanism that has been oppressive of mostly poor, brown, and black people, that has a certain anxiety or an animus, I should say, towards your presence, then you might be willing to say, I'm not really willing to be down for the okie doke, and it's more important for me to have a politics that challenges the status quo, that then celebrates me becoming part of the status quo. So I think the answer to your question really depends on how you politically view yourself as a person in American society, particularly as an African American in American society. And I think that one of the problems I have with this perception of black folks saying, well, the Cosby Show was good for black people. It depends on how you view yourself as a black person, because you can make the argument, well, the Cosby Show helped us create a whole generation of middle-class corporatist Negroes who felt like everything was okay, who also happen to have all their wealth evaporated in the subprime mortgage crisis and now shocked because their sons and daughters' faces are getting blown off by cops and they're screaming Black Lives Matter. So you can also make the argument that the Cosby Show and the mentality of that generation contributed to an anesthesia amongst black folk where they became complicit in their own demise. You can make that argument. I'm not saying that you should agree or not, but I don't think that we should necessarily say that this is all good for black people, this is bad for black people. I think that black people are much more diverse and much more complex and sophisticated than we give ourselves credit for, and I think that it depends on what your politics are. For my politics, having a show, growing up in New York City, and the Mayor Ed Koch administration with Yusef Hawkins, Eleanor Bumpurs, and I grew up in a middle-class black neighborhood, having a TV show in Brooklyn during those years, not talk about racism in New York is fantasy. It's a crock, because I don't know how you could have been a black person living in New York City under Ed Koch's New York in around Reagan years and not talk about racism and not talk about what was going on politically at that time. Now, does that mean that the Cosby Show was some kind of evil conspiracy to neutralize black descent? That's not my point. We don't need to be that reductionist and simplistic when we make these analyses. But the larger point I'm trying to make is that I believe that people in general, Americans of all persuasions, but particularly black folk, considering how media and popular culture has been used to shape an image of us in American society, should not be so willing to take the products of popular culture and raise them to the level of religious devotion simply because we think that they help take a few black kids and send them to college.
Well, here's the thing, and here's the thing that people here's the argument that you'll get, and I give you pushback in terms of this, in terms of black people wanting it to have both ways, right? So if you see black people depicted in media as thugs and rogues, black people complain that look at how we're depicted in the media. This is awful. Okay, then you have Mr. and Mrs. Huxtable, a doctor and a lawyer depicted in media, and then they'll look at Pascal Robert and say, well, here you are again complaining. Again, this time we have a good representation of black people, and black people always have something they want to complain about. Like, isn't that an argument as well in terms of our reaction to the Cosbys or how they could be?
I would make my response to that is that I don't think that there's ever a lack of thing for any American living in a capitalist society to complain about. I think that you should be dissatisfied with everything, a society in which you now have the highest rate of child poverty in America in 40 years functioning in your current era. If you feel that having a country where basically you have 38% of black children living in poverty, it makes you think everything is all right, then you do that, because I'm not one of those kind of people. That's the first thing I would say. Now, the second thing is that that's a fair critique, is that you're unhappy when the images are bad and you're unhappy when the images are good. And I'm going to say I'm unhappy with the concept of someone else controlling my image, period, is what I'm saying. I'm unhappy with the fact that in a society that is premised on economic exploitation of labor and wealth, that I am allowing an external force, not financed or controlled by me realistically, dictate my image in any way. In other words, what I'm saying, and I'm not actually trying to say I'm complaining at all, what I'm saying is that I would advise people to have a much more critical eye in terms of how they interact with pop culture in media. I mean, if you understand the history of media and marketing in America, you study the history of Edwin Bernays, who was basically the father of public relations. Bernays admitted that our goal in creating public relations was to basically to nullify people so that we could create, somewhat what he called a shadow government. Those are his words. That will be allowed to basically control the ins and outs of society without people challenging anything. This is the space in which media and marketing grows out of. I would advise people, if you want to watch a good documentary on the history of marketing and media, you Google The Century of the Self. It's a documentary on the history of Edward Bernays, and this is the man who created basically modern American advertising. And it was not something that just like we just want to make Americans buy Colgate toothpaste and cigarettes. It was a much more nefarious plan behind that. And one of the great examples of how media shifts its use of the black image is that if you read, for example, in Stirrings in the Jug, which is a great book by Adolf Reed about black political history, the image of black people in the 1930s and the early 40s on television was a very kind of Sambo character, negative, in film, not television, because there was no television at that time. The image in film was a very kind of Sambo-esque caricature, very negative, kind of like, Mammy, Aunt Jemima kind of depiction that was quite derogatory and quite exploitative. Yet all of a sudden in the 50s, you have the rise of Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte. All of a sudden, the whole image of black men and black women in film, you're Raisin in the Sun, is much more wholesome. It's like, the noble striver who's trying to survive in the rough, rugged terrain of America. For example, and I think I was talking to you the other day about how the same year in which the Loving decision comes down, legalizing interracial marriage in '67, is the same year that the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner comes out, which Sidney Poitier married interracially. These things don't happen.
And we've also talked about, we saw black presidents in film and movie. Right in the decade or so prior to Obama, you saw the increase of black people as presidents in major motion pictures, and also 24. So you saw that kind of the lead up to the Obama run for presidency. So I think what you're getting at is that how culture is used as a tool to control people and control thinking and to keep people in line, as opposed to something that just grows up organically out of the arts community.
Well, control is not an incorrect word. I would say shape, because it's not like there's a machine putting a button to your mind saying, okay, now go out and buy Coca-Cola. It's like, now you're going to vote for this person. What I'm saying is that the mechanisms of media work in a much more insidious way, in that they create an echo chamber of ideology. And this is not some kind of conspiracy. These are things that have been documented by all types of scholars. I'm reading a book right now called The Black Culture Industry by a British scholar named Ellis Cashmore, who basically talks about this phenomenon, how American society uses black popular culture to enforce racism. Basically, this is the whole premise of his book. So, I don't want people to think that this is something I'm just pulling out of conjecture. There are people who have studied media, race, and politics who have remarked on how popular culture, particularly the use of black popular culture, is used to enforce certain ideas about black people. And the larger point I'm trying to convey in terms of about Bill Cosby is that I'm basically saying that his show and the time in which the show came on is a very convenient way of making it seem like the black community was basically okay with the Reagan years, because the most successful black family show in American history is on during a time in which basically you have crack cocaine, eviscerating urban areas, and you have, gang-related violence, and you have not only that, but more importantly, you have the government retracting on the civil rights legacy by cutting back social programs. And I think that that's an analysis that few of us in the black community have ever made when we talk about when these shows come up and what space of time they come up in and what they actually mean. My goal here is not to leverage any further indictment on Bill Cosby at all. I mean, listen, there's enough of that being done. I'm actually not even interested in the politics. I'm not saying I'm not interested. I think it's a tragedy, and I think that in terms of the abuse of women, there's a lot to talk about there. But for me, I think that the importance of what the Cosby opportunity presents is to ask ourselves collectively, black people and all people, why is it necessary for us to allow these mechanisms to be the things that have such a determinative effect on the choices we make in our lives, as opposed to us being able to make those choices ourselves and because if you're saying that this show is so valuable and that, Cosby is responsible for having so many black people go to college. So what you're saying is that basically TV is the only thing that can get Negroes to get an education, that Negroes are so incapable of, black people are so incapable of seeing the need and value in education that you have to have a television program to basically motivate them, which is ridiculous because the educational boom in the black community that happened during the 80s and early 90s is not happening in a vacuum only because of Bing Cosby. First of all, the largest growth of the black middle class in American history post-civil rights is during that period of time. There is a massive, massive influx of black people going to colleges and universities, regardless of Cosby. And I'm not saying his show did not encourage that, but what I'm saying, the larger point I'm trying to get to is that these things don't happen in a vacuum, and we should be more critical of trying to assess what exactly is the function and the role that these programs have, and why is it that African Americans tend to be so largely emotionally attached to their pop culture depiction. And even a more important question to me is that why is it that the only spaces in which we are allowed to be humanized as black people are in those that are for the sheer entertainment value of American society and white folk? I think that there's something fundamentally insidious about the fact that the only place that you can see yourself validated as a human being in America is as a singer, a dancer, a comedian, or an athlete. There's something to me that is fundamentally problematic.
I think I understand your point, and I think that's a good space for us to end right now. And I would encourage people who watch the video to a comment in the comment section, because I'm curious as to the reaction that this conversation is going to get, because I know people have been very protective of, even if not of Bill Cosby the person, of Bill Cosby the actual entertainer. And I'm the first one to admit that I always knew I was going to college somewhere, but it was actually, it was a different world that kind of encouraged me to attend an HBCU. And so I'm not one to say that. So I don't say that I'm not discounting that at all. But I am curious as to the conversation that is going to surround this conversation. So I want to thank you for that, Pascal. I want to thank you for your time. And we may have to come back and revisit this if that's okay with you.
No problem.
All right. Thanks, Pascal.